Lars is professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Bergen, Norway. He is the author of several books, including A Philosophy of Boredom, Fashion, A Philosophy of Fear, and Work. His books have been translated into 24 languages, and Philosophy of Evil, published by Dalkey Archive Press, is the most recently translated into English. We're very privileged to have Lars here this evening, and I'd like to thank him on behalf of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you. And, well, these lights are quite strong, so I cannot see you, but I assume that you can see me. Well, yeah, I'm here to talk about this little book, A Philosophy of Evil. And when I first seriously took up the subject of evil quite a number of years ago, I faced a particular challenge. I had to prove that the idea in general was still relevant to philosophical discussion. Back then, of course, the idea was undergoing a nascent renaissance. However, among most of my colleagues in philosophy, and even more so among my colleagues in other disciplines, the idea of evil was mainly seen as a holdover from a mythical Christian worldview whose time was already past. Initially, as I began to attempt this rehabilitation of the concept of evil, the idea itself was still primarily an object of fascination for me. This fascination was a result, most especially, of our tendency to regard evil as an aesthetic object, where evil appears as something other and therefore functions as an alternative to the banality of everyday life. And I think that my approach in the book entitled A Philosophy of Boredom is in itself an example of such an approach. And we're steadily exposed to more and more extreme representations of evil in films and such, but this form of evil isn't really something that fits into a moral category. Evil has become aestheticized. In fiction, evil feeds off its fictional nature. It poses a contrast to the banality of everyday life and represents a transcendence of the same. And when such an aesthetic gaze becomes dominant, we lose sight of the very horror associated with evil. As a purely aesthetic phenomenon, evil becomes a game without consequences, something we can gorge ourselves on, play around with, or shed a tear about, without worrying that the knife will cut too deep. Eventually, however, my rehabilitation of the concept of evil took a more serious turn. And in Europe, we paid close attention to the events in former Yugoslavia, the reports of mass murder, rape, and torture. And Yugoslavia was a shock. We thought such things didn't happen in the light of day, at least not in our part of the world. Evil was the only word that could express the horror of these events. And then came September 11, 2001. And suddenly, the idea of evil assumed a far more prominent place in political discourse. That day, George W. Bush declared, "Today, our nation saw evil." Tony Blair remarked that mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today, and that we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world. Those events, as well as the years that have followed, have also shown us how potent the idea of evil still is, and how dangerous the use of the very word can be. And extreme actions undertaken by monsters are among the clearest ideas we have of evil. And perhaps there really are human monsters in the world. And by that I simply mean people whose actions are so extreme that we simply cannot manage to identify ourselves with them. But there are simply too few of these monsters to explain the abundance of human evil in general. In the end, it is we normal, more or less decent, respectable people, who are responsible for most of the damage. We are the only explanation for all the evil in the world. And from this point of view, it's normal to be evil. Of course, we aren't eager to describe ourselves as evil. If anyone is evil, it's always them. Now, even if the idea of evil might seem outdated as a holdover from a pre-modern era, evil is still a reality for us. This is true even when we manage to forget, sometimes for quite a long time, that evil does exist. Sooner or later, something comes along to serve as a brutal reminder. It seems the recognition of evil surfaces again and again, only to be forgotten. And we recognize evil when it has a face, when it has an identity. That's what happened in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and in the United States on September 11th, 2001. Now, in his introduction to the book The Death of Satan, Andrew Del Blanco observes that today there's an enormous gap between our experience of evil and our intellectual capacity for understanding it. In Christian culture, Satan was the scapegoat, but when God died, Satan followed suit. And we, Satan's murderers, lost the ability to talk about evil. Because how can you talk about evil without the aid of evil incarnate? And Jean Baudrillard asked, what's become of evil in our day and age? And answers that it resides everywhere. Baudrillard's idea is reminiscent of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Snow Queen, where the devil's mirror, which warps everything it reflects, showing its worst possible manifestation. That mirror splinters, and the splinters land in every human eye and heart, dooming mankind to see something evil or corrupt everywhere we turn. For most of us, the idea of evil isn't something we associate so much with our everyday reality, with our day-to-day experiences and routines. But we nonetheless come in contact with it almost constantly by means of the mass media. We watch and read reports of genocide, famine, unmotivated violence, trafficking. And we live in this paradoxical situation where evil is both absent and omnipresent, usually absent in our day-to-day experience and everywhere in the reality we perceive in the media. Thus, for Baudrillard, evil is everywhere, and since it's everywhere, we've lost our capacity to talk about it. Evil has become decentralized. It's no longer located in a single image. Baudrillard goes further, however, saying that this omnipresence of evil is made possibly precisely because we don't know how to talk about it. He argues, therefore, that it's imperative to restore dualism and resurrect the principle of evil, as found in Manichaeism and other mythologies, and oppose it to the principle of good. I think that's a pretty bad idea. I think that this is pretty much what we've seen in the aftermath of September 11th. On the other hand, Andrew Del Blanco maintains that our understanding of evil should be reawakened instead of restored, though he makes no practical suggestion as to how such a reawakening might take place. We might object to all this and say that evil has always existed everywhere. And evil can refer to such a diverse number of phenomena that the concept seems beyond our comprehension. Perhaps then, the idea of evil can indeed only be grasped through mythological representation. This is the point of departure for Paul Ricoeur's theory on the symbolism of evil. Ricoeur maintains that evil is more or less inaccessible to philosophical reflection because Human reason presupposes a meaningful whole, a meaningful context that has no room for the idea of evil, whereas myths and symbols act as resources to aid our understanding. The danger is that myths can very easily be transformed into ontology. That is, what starts as a means of representation is confused with an actual active force. And then the myth becomes an explanation rather than a symbol. Ricoeur insists that the dissolution of myth as explanation is necessary for the return of myth as symbol. But what symbolism of evil is still available for us? We certainly don't need the idea of an otherworldly hell. Nazi and communist concentration camps, for instance, have done a remarkable job of embodying on earth the same notion of hell that we inherited from our religious traditions. Likewise, we don't need the idea of a supernatural devil to understand what an evil agent is. I mean, they live among us. Even though we can't continue to locate evil in a single place or agent, surely we can recognize that it manifests itself more fully in certain places and certain agents than in others. There are relatively few these days who would deny that evil exists in the world. But there are many who will deny that there is such a thing as an evil person. Do evil people exist? Well, if doing evils to others suffices for one to be called evil, then the answer is a resounding yes. The same holds true if we further insist that evil, to be evil, must be committed with some sort of intent, not just accidentally. On the other hand, if we go on to insist that evil is only properly evil when it is committed because it is evil, that is, the motivation for an evil act must reside in the very fact of its being evil, then I would be very skeptical myself. The idea of evil seems to be making a comeback in the field of ethics, after for a long time being largely associated with theological problems beyond the scope of a more scientifically oriented philosophy. Instead of evil, we've talked about asocial tendencies, dysfunctions that can be corrected, dysfunctions often regarded as having a chemical or social cause. The problem, however, is that our vocabulary doesn't match our experience. We can blame a perpetrator, but we cannot morally blame a dysfunction. A dysfunction can merely be corrected. We look for the causes of evil, and these causes are located outside of the discussion of morality. They can be natural or social. They can range from natural inclination and illness to poverty and traumatic childhood experiences. However, if you attribute all human evil to such causes located outside of the individual, understood as a moral subject, simply to provide a scientific explanation, you've suddenly reduced moral evil to natural evil, and thereby, in effect, done away with all moral standards. Such reductionism, however, is completely contrary to our experience of ourselves and others as moral agents, subject to ideas such as guilt and responsibility. There's always something more, something irreducible, something that doesn't simply vanish without a trace into the chain of cause and effect, something that allows us to make choices, a thing we could call free will. Without free will, moral evil simply does not exist. Thus, our attempts to explain away evil, to rationalize it, have never been completely successful. The fact that an individual is free means that in a given situation, he or she could have acted differently. It follows that when we commit evil, that we can be accused or blamed for not having acted differently. And it is clear, despite everything, that we continue to have a general, if vague, understanding of evil, and we can use the word to refer to events, actions, and people. These events, actions, and people might also be described using other terms, of course. The question is whether the word evil aids our understanding. In my opinion, it does. The idea is a valuable tool when we attempt to orient ourselves in the enigmatic landscape we call the world. And evil is not simply a single overarching problem. Instead, it represents a number of concrete phenomena that all contribute to making life less than good. Evil is a broad concept we use to describe actions and suffering. In fact, the idea refers to such a manifold. For instance, illness, natural catastrophes, death, war, genocide, terrorism, drug trade, slavery, rape, child abuse, etc., that it can appear to be so broad as to lose all specific content. All these various evils, however, are recognized as evils suffered by humanity. And the idea of evil, therefore, it is applicable, even though it's very hard to pin down the necessary and sufficient conditions for use of the term. Of course, in order to reconcile ourselves with the existence of these evils, we tend to seek meaning behind evil. Such meaning would ensure that the world's existence was justified and allows us to hope that things could change for the better. We find meaning in different places, in religion, in our belief in progress, in political ideologies. My general attitude, however, is that evil neither can nor should be justified, and that every attempt to reconcile ourselves to the suffering in the world is wrong. There is simply no meaning to be found in the countless tragedies of human history. They cannot be justified by any divine plan or active historical force. I mean, I think it's so annoying when people say everything happens for a reason. No, it doesn't. It's just plain wrong. The purpose of my book is not to plumb the depths in order to find the root of all evil. Instead, I've attempted to stay as close to the surface as possible, close to the place, that is, where the phenomena of evil tend to show themselves. If I'm going to understand evil, I have to begin on the surface, at the place evil appears in our lives. Ricoeur, as I mentioned earlier, argues that the price we pay for clarity, dealing with a demythologized concept, is the loss of depth. However, when dealing with the idea of evil, the surface itself, it's so demanding that it seems premature to just go in depth straight away. And we can all recognize evil without having a theory of evil. Evil is an unavoidable aspect of the world, and it precedes philosophical reflection because it's found in experiences that form the basis for such reflection. In this respect, philosophy itself is understood as the act of reflecting on a meaning or experience that already exists. Philosophy takes its content and legitimacy from what is already understood. This viewpoint is methodically significant because it requires philosophy to maintain contact with the pre-philosophical if it is to retain its legitimacy. On the one hand, therefore, evil is something abstract and elusive. On the other hand, something concrete and tangible. An abused child, a bomb that kills innocents, a people slaughtered, all these things are concrete events. But when we attempt to understand the evil inherent in these events, we often lose ourselves in greater and greater abstractions that become steadily less tangible. Ultimately, we remain lost in abstraction and therefore lose sight of the concrete evil that was the basis for our initial reflection. And it's striking that most explanations of evil simply explain it away. This is especially evident in the countless theodicies that compose the greatest percentage of the literature on evil. And to avoid losing sight of concrete evil was one of the main goals of my book. So I attempted to write a relatively concrete study of evil with lots of historical examples, which I unfortunately cannot go into in this lecture. But the main point of my book is quite simple. Evil is not first and foremost a concept, but rather a practical problem for us. The question of how evil entered into the world, whether it has actual being or can only be understood as an absence, etc., is less important than the question of how evil can be prevented. And along the way, political questions replace classical ontological questions regarding evil. And I might as well also say that I really do not believe that Auschwitz or Bosnia can reveal any deep metaphysical truths about modern Western culture, about civilizations, telos, or the like. What happened was that a group of individuals acting under certain political, social, and material conditions persecuted, tortured, and murdered other individuals. There is no good reason why an understanding of such events should require us to refer to historical metaphysical principles, the deepest levels of a person's spiritual being, or the like. We're dealing with concrete agents in a concrete socio-material space, and it's important to maintain the agent perspective here. A socio-material space never unfolds by itself. It's made up of individuals who act in accordance with the possibilities and limitations imposed by that space. Genocide is possible only if a relatively large number of individuals are willing to murder a large number of other individuals over a relatively long period of time. We can put forth a host of explanations on different levels, and they can all shed light on the phenomenon, but we ultimately cannot escape the fact that the individuals in a group must be willing to murder the individuals in another group because they belong to the other group. No tyrant or dictator acting alone can bring about the persecution of large groups of people. For the most part, too, those individuals who take part in persecutions know the difference between right and wrong. They know that people shouldn't torture and murder their fellow men, but they don't let this moral insight influence their actions. And evil acts always have a multitude of different reasons and causes. It's important to keep this complexity in mind rather than to reduce all evil to a single root cause. Many theories of evil posit that the root of an evil action is the intent to do evil. That is, that evil is a goal in and of itself. This is what I will refer to as demonic evil. And theories which reduce all evil to the demonic form cause us to lose sight of the myriad of other varieties. Such a one-sided focus on demonic evil also encourages us to regard the problem of evil as irrelevant for understanding ourselves, simply because we do not see ourselves as demons. But evil isn't limited to demons. And most of those who take part in genocides are completely normal people without any special sadistic dispositions. Under certain circumstances, we are all capable of doing unspeakable things to our fellow men. And figures who are purely good or purely evil, they abound in the history of fiction. But in the real world, people are good and evil. Some have more good in them than evil, others more evil than good, but all are a combination of both. It all boils down to the fact that we're free. This is why we cannot be, any of us, unambiguously good or evil. And understanding this is essential for understanding who we are. And in discussing evil, I think it is a methodological error to reduce a manifold of phenomena to one basic form. It's more informative, I think, to propose a typology of the different forms of evil as they present themselves and consider how the various types are related. Just having a sip of water, if I can find the opening here. Quite warm with these lights as well. Now, if we limit ourselves to a consideration of moral evil as it pertains to human conduct, and which therefore excludes natural and metaphysical evil, I distinguish between 4 basic types of evil. Demonic evil is the first, and I think that's by far the least relevant type. This form of evil, taken for granted by numerous theorists, is defined as the activity of doing evil precisely because it is evil. I find this conception extremely problematic and discuss it at length in my book. But I will not spend very much time on it here in this lecture today. The second variety is instrumental evil. That concerns agents who do something evil, well aware that it is evil, in order to accomplish some other goal. The goal can be good, but the means evil. Therefore, instrumental evil concerns the means, not the goal. Evil is instrumental if the agent would have abandoned the action if the goal, say wealth, could have been achieved in some other way. In this respect, an instrumentally evil action does not have any value in and of itself. And those who carry out instrumental evil do not take pleasure in the action itself so much as in the accomplishment of their goal. Now moving on to the third variety, which I think is probably the most important. That's idealistic evil, which results when agents do something evil in the belief that they're doing something good. Consider, for instance, the Christian Crusades or the witch and heretic trials. No doubt, most of the participants in these events consider themselves to be representatives of the good. Terrorists can usually be described as idealists who believe they're on the side of the good. Consequently, what they do seem to be justified by the struggle against evil. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, many Bolsheviks were idealists, even those who condemned innocent people to death, knowing beforehand that they were innocent. This is demonstrated by the fact that a number of these same people willingly confessed to crimes they weren't guilty of, crimes punishable by death for the sake of the party and the revolution. Many Nazis were certainly idealists, driven by an ambition to create what they saw as a better society, and the SS considered themselves to be a moral elite. Some might say now, but these ideals are perverse. Yes, of course they are, but the fact that an ideal is perverse does not make the person who has the ideal to any less of an idealist. For idealists, in contrast to those who do instrumental evil, it will often appear that it is not only morally acceptable, but frankly, morally required to harm others for a good cause. Enemies embody an evil that must be fought. Idealists can recognize that certain actions are deplorable, but will continue to insist that they're justified by a higher mission. And those who do evil often act as if they represent the good, and oftentimes they believe it too. But the conviction that an ideal is good is not enough to guarantee that it really is good. The fourth variety is stupid evil, which is characterized by an agent who acts without stopping to consider whether his actions are good or evil. Stupid evil is different from idealistic evil, which is characterized by an agent who thinks about good and evil, but thinks wrongly. And this form of stupidity can be understood as a form of thoughtlessness, an absence of reflection, and it's certainly something that can be found in people of high intelligence. I mean, when you've spent a couple of years at university, you've run into quite a few of those. And it's this form of evil that Hannah Arendt describes as banal evil. And it can be difficult to decide which of the four categories a certain agent or action belongs to. And a single agent can belong to more than one category. An idealist, for instance, can easily become a really stupid fanatic. That is, he no longer assumes responsibility for thinking a situation through and begins to follow a given set of directions slavishly. This is how idealistic evil can become stupid evil. Further, a problem with the category of instrumental evil is that it threatens to become so broad that it can subsume virtually all the other categories under itself, because motivated actions always have some goal. One thing all four types of evil have in common is the lack of regard for other people's dignity. And the four types of evil will therefore serve as a tentative foundation for my further discussion in the book. And the problem now with so many theories of evil is that they assume evil's goal is to cause harm, that evil is autotelic rather than instrumental, in other words, demonic. In reality, however, demonic evil is a marginal phenomenon if it exists at all. And theories which reduce all evil to the demonic type lose sight of the other forms. And moreover, such a one-sided focus also leads us to lose sight of ourselves, because we, certainly, as I've said, don't tend to think of ourselves as demons. This notion of evil, therefore, seems irrelevant to an understanding of our own conduct. And evil isn't limited to sadists, and most of the participants in genocides and the like are no more demonic than you or I. And it's commonplace to say that we all have a dark side, that we all have the capacity to do wrong. I'm certainly not alone in making such an assertion. This notion becomes rather unhelpful, however, if not wholly obtuse, if we don't try to identify those things that cause an otherwise healthy, sane person to do something truly atrocious. The question we should ask ourselves isn't simply, is it possible, but what would it take for me to do something similar? And as I have limited time at my disposal, I will concentrate on one variety of evil, the idealistic variety. And in my opinion, ideas about evil have caused more evil than just about anything else. Projects intended to overcome both illusory and actual evils have brought far more evil into the world than any straightforward attempt at transgression. And human aggression is driven more by ideas than by hormones. As human beings, we struggle to find meaning. In seeking meaning and creating meaning, we create ideas that become basis for action. Two of our most central concepts are good and evil. and these are often correlated with the difference between us and them. And the devils, the evil people, are always others, never oneself. And throughout history, we have repeatedly seen the catastrophic results of the desire to cleanse the earth of something people consider to be evil incarnate. There is a thought-provoking continuity between the witch and heretic trials of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Nazi mass exterminations. The innocent people who were condemned for witchcraft and heresy and then burned at the stake were persecuted by people who believed that they stood on the side of the good. And people who resort to violence often, actually most commonly, see themselves as representatives of the good, fighting for a just cause. This was undoubtedly the case with many of the Christian crusaders. It's also the case with today's terrorists. From the victim's perspective, however, the situation appears quite different. And this is also the case with common murders. When you look into murders that are not related to some sort of gain, the perpetrator usually sees himself, it's more often a man than a woman. Men kill 26 times more frequently than women, even though a woman in Detroit is more inclined to kill you than a man in London. Just some statistics in there for good measure. See themselves as acting justly. Now, we structure the world and define ourselves through opposed ideas such as Christian, heretic, man, woman, Aryan, Jew, Greek, barbarian, white, black, Hutu, Tutsi, etc. These conceptual pairs distinguish first and foremost between us and them, and they vary with different historical, geographical, and social contexts. The distinction between us and them is essential for identity formation. So, we cannot simply avoid doing it. The problem is that these conceptual pairs are often interpreted asymmetrically and form the basis for discrimination. And the word devil comes from the Greek verb diabalein, which means to distinguish between or divide. And evil finds place when human bonds are broken, when concrete relationships crumble for the sake of abstract identifications. And to use a biblical image, when we divide the world into sheep and goats, into good and evil, then the sheep, the safe proclaimed good, have a tendency to subject the goats to the most horrendous acts. And in doing so, the sheep's group identity is made stronger, something that forms the basis for new identifications of goats. It ties them together. That's why Philip Goodrich, in an excellent little book on genocide in Rwanda, says that, after all, genocide is an exercise in community building. And we have a tendency to forget the wrongs that are done to people we've labeled as evil. The fact that the other is evil is often regarded as a sufficient reason to use more or less any necessary means to combat him. However, the fact that the other is evil does not mean that we are necessarily good. It's entirely possible that both sides are evil. This is a really basic but essential point. Even if we have good reason to describe the other as evil, we cannot use the fact of their evil as a guarantee that whatever means we use to fight them is good. Now, the latter conclusion is all too common. The world is a pretty complicated place. But in ideas of evil, this complexity is often reduced to a single binary opposition. The world becomes little less than a metaphysical drama between good and evil. There's good, there's evil, and no other alternatives. And a notable trait of large-scale persecutions and exterminations is that the relation between attacker and victim is reversed in the attacker's eyes, so that the attacker becomes the actual victim. The blame rests on the shoulders of the victim, who is represented as and considered to be the aggressor. And for the most part, it stems from the inner logic of group thinking. Immoral evil traits and practices are usually described to the other, even when there is no real evidence for the accusations. A sense of group belonging is created from and based on judgments regarding one's own group in opposition to other groups. And characteristics that distinguish us from them can be something as trivial as cheering for different soccer teams. Now, I may be in trouble if I describe that as trivial, but I'm not a huge football fan, so I might be missing something here. But it should suffice to mention the 1985 tragedy at Heysel Stadium in Brussels, where Juventus faced off against Liverpool and 38 people were killed in the bleachers. That showed just how insane the us-them binary can be. The perceived difference between us and them can be based on extremely insignificant details, tremendously small differences, differences so small that they seem utterly irrelevant to outsiders, can create intense hatred. And the difference between us and them, which is often based on these trivial characteristics, can and does lead to systematic discrimination. And even if the quality that forms the basis for the categorization is not an ethically relevant quality, it results in ethical consequences. In the most extreme cases, such as the extermination of the Jews, moral categories were generally considered to be inapplicable to the group. I mean, the group was simply excluded from the moral arena. And the classical Aristotelian principle that says that like cases should be handled as like, and that unlike cases should be treated as relevantly unlike, is systematically undermined by our group solidarities. And to use Aristotle's expression, human beings are political animals. We tend to live in herds. And group solidarity seems to be pretty much a basic human necessity, even though there are hermits. But it becomes dangerous when the group becomes too tightly knit, when the individuals in the group stop thinking as individuals and stop reflecting on the group's values, ideals, and actions. And when the difference between us and them is truly established, individuals will often substitute the group's values and judgments for their own. The need for individual reflection disappears, and thinking for yourself can seem disloyal to the group. And under Hitler, it was even illegal. It was in opposition to the Führerprinzip. And groups are quite dangerous because a mass cannot have a conscience. Conscience always belongs to an individual. And therefore, individuals in a group can sometimes seem to have broken free of the demands of morality. And group identity triumphs over individual moral reflection. And to surrender individuality means to surrender the capacity for moral thinking and vice versa. You must consider yourself to be an individual in order to recognize the other as an individual. The depersonalization of the self leads to the depersonalization of the other. And William Blake writes, "None can see the man in the enemy. I cannot love my enemy, for my enemy is not man, but beast and devil." End quote. It is difficult to see an enemy as an individual, because the idea of the enemy gets in the way of common humanity. You shouldn't kill another human being, we all know that. But when the other is seen as a monster, it's often considered acceptable to eradicate this threat. Recognizing the humanity of each and every person is essential, or rather, it is essential not to lose sight of a person's humanity in view of ideologies or group identity. Now, what can we conclude from the discussion of the different types of human evil? Essentially, just this, that, well, people should be regarded as good and evil rather than good or evil. Evil is a possibility and, in effect, an actuality in all of us because we are free moral beings. Evil is part of our common humanity, as is goodness. And this is not to say that every person has the same mixture of good and evil. It's obvious that this is not the case. Some people are certainly more evil than others. And our task in examining the problem of evil is not to create a new system of morals, because where on earth would we begin? But rather to insist on the relevance and worth of the morals we already have. And these morals place us under clear obligations, no matter what theoretical standpoint we take. It's indisputable that we have a duty to respect human worth, prevent suffering, and so on. We can argue about the theoretical basis for human rights, but how many reasons do we really need before we realize that people should not be murdered, maimed, tortured, and so on? And to take another example, I mean, most people seem to believe that slavery is something that merely belongs to the past. Proof is that there are more slaves on this planet today than at any previous point in history. Conservative estimate is 27 million. I mean, the relative number has been higher earlier, but the actual number has never been higher. I mean, what do they need? Not really for us to ponder all that much about the intricacies of theodicies. I mean, there are different needs here. And we should proceed negatively rather than try to realize these grand positive visions. Much concrete good can be done to work against poverty, sickness, discrimination, torture, war, etc. And it's interesting to see that there are far fewer differences in opinion between people regarding what's evil than what is good. Ethics has a greater consensus on the negative side than on the positive side. Therefore, the identification of evil and the agreement that evil must be fought can largely be attained no matter what ethical or meta-ethical position one takes. And though different concepts of the good can lead to different priorities in the struggle against evil, all people agree on one thing: these evils and others like them must be opposed. And of course, this is where it gets really, really difficult, because we're obligated to oppose these evils. And yet, history has taught us that when we oppose them, we frequently create even greater evils. And there is no such thing as a moral algorithm, a fancy ethical theory in which you can put in these variables and then you will get the correct answer at the end. It's far more difficult than that. It takes moral judgment, and moral judgment sometimes leads us astray. But still, we have this obligation. And evil is not merely a theoretical problem, it's a highly practical one. And all our countless theoretical blind spots serve only to prevent us from arriving at one simple insight, that evil is not primarily a subject for theology, the natural or social sciences, or even philosophy, but a concrete problem that must be addressed in the moral and political arena. The most important question is not what is evil, but why do we do it and how can we prevent it? And the answer to why we do it is that we do evil for a number of different reasons. And we all have a variety of motives. But one reason I really wouldn't put much weight on is doing evil because it's evil. This pure form of evil, demonic evil, should, as I see it, essentially be dismissed as a myth. And yet, demonic evil is so often regarded as evil's fundamental form. And as I've said, the problem with considering evil in this light is that it makes the phenomenon appear external to ourselves, because we do not see ourselves as demons. And the problem then with focusing on demonic evil is not theoretical but practical. It hinders the realization of the capacity we all have for evil. And more to the point, we often do evil well aware that it's evil because we want to realize, for instance, subjective good. But this instrumental evil can only explain so much of our evil actions. We must also take the idealistic and stupid evil into account. And really, our basic problem is not a surplus of aggression. Instead, it's a lack of reflection. And this lack leads people to accept and even participate in the most lunatic transgressions imaginable against their fellow men. And pure egotism is a motivating factor in far fewer murders and assaults than unreflective, unselfish surrender to a higher purpose. And simple indifference leads to probably even more victims. Can we imagine a world without evil? I seriously doubt such a thing is conceivable. In this world, we may all be victims of evil, at least potentially, but we also inflict evil on others. There are many reasons for this, not least being that we are moral creatures, and as moral creatures, we divide what we see in the world into good and evil. And whatever threatens or harms us is labeled evil. We all wish to make the world a habitable place, and therefore reflect on how we can gain control of evil. And we're on the lookout for evil, even when there's no immediate threat, because we want to try to go out and get a jump on it. We localize evil so we can fight it. And we often think, we are persuaded that we must be good, since we're fighting the good fight. Perhaps we can say finally that humanity itself is the root of all evil. Animals cannot be evil, only we can. And despite the attempts of the Enlightenment and humanism to find a different culprit, the short answer to the question concerning the origin of evil remains this: evil exists because people are free. And to be free moral agents implies that we are good and evil. It does not imply that we are all good and evil to the same degree. And it certainly does not imply that the amount of evil in the world will or must always be the same. So what is the solution then? The most dangerous response is the belief that if only we can localize and exterminate the world's forces of evil, then evil might be eradicated once and for all. In that case, we overlook Alexander Solzhenitsyn's observation that the line dividing good and evil does not first and foremost run through different groups, nations, classes, or political parties, but right through every human heart. And personally, the only solution I see to the problem of evil is a continuation of a humanist project and of Enlightenment thinking. I have no illusion that it will eradicate evil in the world once and for all, but at least it offers us the hope that it might be limited. Thank you. That was the lecture. And now we will have a Q&A.
Just because Lars can't see you because of the lights, if you hold your hands,
I was watching the last few days. Thank you very much. I was watching the birds in my little garden, and I noticed a terrible consternation. Those birds were screaming all over the place, so to speak, and a magpie was around, 2 magpies. Now, the problem was that the magpie was trying to steal the little birds from the blue tit's nest. And, you know, one's immediate reaction was to frighten away the magpie, or to even shoot it, maybe if you had a gun. But the magpie was getting these birds to feed its own young. So we are not that divided from the magpies and the other animals. A lot of evil, I don't believe in the concept at all, but a lot of what we, for the sake of an idea, a lot of evil comes out of fear. What disappointed me a bit about the lecture was that you supported all the things of Western ways of looking at life. For example, you talked about terrorists creating evil.
And of course, when I also said in my lecture that we should definitely try to avoid the creation of these huge utopian goods, because that's what's really led to the grand disasters. And as for racism, I mean, when you look at Stalin's practices, I mean, so many of the exterminations were ethnically motivated and so on, when you look into the material. So yeah. So yeah, of course, communism is a very good example that good intentions can really, really lead you astray. As for the first bit about humans and animals, I mean, there are significant differences, and here I'm pretty much an orthodox Darwinist. Darwin himself pointed out that this moral sense and so on can only be found in humans as opposed to all the other higher animals and so on. So, I mean, there are qualitative differences there, which puts us in a separate category.
I was only saying that fear is behind
Yeah.
fear of the magpie.
Yeah, I would agree that fear is a crucial part of it, and I've written a book on fear called A Philosophy of Fear. And I think that what is also important is that we as bystanders have an obligation sometimes to intervene and try to show that this fear is not rational. Try to correct the pictures. I mean, as bystanders, we can actually become participants trying to redefine the moral consensus, showing that something is problematic, showing that a certain spread that's fearing is unfounded and so on. We can do these things, and we should do these things.
I promised a brief question on Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, but you've just said you're a Darwinian evolutionist, and so am I, and I see that as our animal drives developed by humans having a big brain, because we are human animals, that leads to evil. It's the big brain theory. But Hannah Arendt is, you've got the SS and the Germans in 3, evil idealists, Hannah Arendt, the stupid idealist. It's not widely known, and perhaps you could comment on this, that she had an argument with the German existentialist philosopher Karl Jaspers at the beginning of the war, and he was saying this Hitler should be treated as tyrant, deal with him, get rid of this thug, and she said, good God, he's not a thug, he's much more than that, he's this dreadful man. And he stuck to his guns and said that he did not want to attribute to Hitler and his ilk any satanic greatness or any grandeur of intent. So he was saying, don't go down that road too far. And I'm not saying he won the argument, but she thought about this later, and when she came up with banality of evil, thinking about Adolf Eichmann, so many evil acts are the more easy ones to define as banal, and so on. So I see a gradation. I don't know what you think about this, but the more examples you have in your book on evil, the more banal it is, it's easier to pinpoint it. When it becomes dreadful, it's like psychopathic madness, and these people are being left off the hook because they're not that responsible.
Yeah. One thing I think is important to mention about Arendt was that when she made this argument about the banality of evil, she did not attempt to say that, oh, this is the only variety of evil that exists. She saw it as, here's a category of evil that we have somehow missed because we've been led astray by these other images of evil. That being said, I'm pretty frustrated with Arendt's book because, first of all, it's very famous for this phrase, the banality of evil. But the phrase only occurs 3 times in the book, and one of them is in the title. So it's not very clear exactly what the banality of evil amounts to. Secondly, I also think that she has a little bit simplistic portrayal of Eichmann. For instance, she downplays his idealistic side, his Hitlerism, in order to make him fit more smoothly into this category of banal evil. But then again, she is onto something. And so I think it's a worthwhile contribution, but it only manages to get a little part of it. And of course, Nazis, I mean, that's not a... I mean, that group also contains varieties. You have people driven solely by ambition, careers and so on. You have idealists. You have utter morons. I mean, Rudolf Höss, for instance, the commander in Auschwitz, he's definitely a huge moron. I mean, there's no other term that could be applied. Horrendous moron. So you really have to go case by case. Yeah.
I just wanted to, I think like the gentleman there, I kind of have a bit of a difficulty with the concept of evil itself. Yeah. Primarily just because I think that it's very similar, principally because the majority of people view evil as being what you would call evil for evil's sake, and in fact there is no other type of evil, and so we tend to lump all these negative acts into this evil group, when in fact probably terms like psychosis as a motivator behind the act is probably more likely. But I'm just wondering whether or not you think the solution here is to stop using terms like evil, or to really involve ourselves in the traditional Christian model of what evil is and redefine that, some form of sympathy or salvation for the devil, I suppose, where that would lead to.
Yeah, so of course I've thought quite a bit about this. I remember when I published my book in Denmark, I was on a lecture tour there, and then this one person in the audience asked me immediately after the lecture, why do you introduce this concept of evil? And I had to say that, sorry, I didn't introduce it. It was there way before me. But of course, what she meant was, why do you continue to use it? And of course, I mean, we are moral beings. We have values, and our axis of value has a positive and a negative pole. And for portions of the negative pole there, simply to describe something as immoral, for instance, it's it's not sufficient to say that, well, Srebrenica was immoral. It's too weak. It really does not capture the horror of what happened. So, I mean, I see it as serving a purpose in our moral orientation. On the other hand, I also see the concept of evil as an extremely dangerous concept, precisely because you can use it to give some sort of legitimacy to all these horrendous acts. So what I set out to do was to create a more nuanced understanding of evil, trying to say that we have to think through what we mean by evil, what we shouldn't mean by evil, when we should employ the term, the dangers of employing the term. Furthermore, I attempted to make a completely secular concept of evil that you should be able to discuss rationally, whether you're Christian or agnostic or atheist. That was at least my ambition, to make a completely secular concept, which really...
I think the difficulty I have with it, I think perpetuation of the idea that evil has the risk of continuing acts which we perceive as evil. I think the creation of the axis of evil, and this notion that there has been something we should attack and destroy, has created actions which are
Yeah.
entirely evil. So I think, like I say, if you can deconstruct the notion of evil itself, and yes, it's not necessarily immoral, the Holocaust was immoral, but it was psychotic. It's a mass psychosis.
I'd say when you describe it as a mass psychosis, you take it out of the moral realm, and it's definitely a moral phenomenon. So it's simply a misdescription. Yeah.
I think that some people have sort of touched on the idea of determinism indirectly with the idea of psychosis and so on. And I wondered whether maybe that could be linked with the issue of the word evil, and whether maybe the word evil should only be applied to acts and not to actual human beings, as human beings are the human action is the result of cause and effect. And therefore, it's problematic because that brings into question the idea of moral responsibility. But I sometimes feel that the act and the person cannot be described with the same words, and I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I guess I'm a fairly old-fashioned Aristotelian in that sense. If you commit evil acts, then you're an evil person. I mean, how could you... I mean, what are you in abstraction from what you actually do? I mean, that makes up who you are. As for determinism, if everything boils down to that there is nothing but these chains of cause and effect, then moral evil evaporates. Then there is no such thing. We could still talk about natural evil. I mean, a world without any free will whatsoever could contain vast amounts of suffering. It could be naturally evil world, but there would be no moral evil there. So, but of course, is determinism true? I mean, God, that's a huge issue. Unfortunately, one I'm writing a book on at the moment. So I'm trying not to get led astray here. Let's put it this way. There is no smoking gun here in the whole determinism question. There is absolutely no conclusive proof one way or the other, and there never will be for a number of reasons. If you look at towards the natural sciences at the moment, some sort of indeterminism seems to be the more common idea. But of course that doesn't settle the question either. So I would rather say that if you now imagine the world you live in, and then you abstract away everything called personal responsibility, anything called blame and praise, all normative responses from one human being to another, simply lose all that in abstraction. What you're left with then is a world which really doesn't resemble the one you're living in. And then I would ask you, given how a radical change that would be in your perception of the world, are the arguments for determinism really that good? I don't think so. so that might be one way of approaching it. But I mean, this is a huge issue. So one which we probably won't be able to settle here now.
I think that most faiths do actually also say that there's a struggle within the human heart in terms of good and evil motives and intentions, and as to which prevails, that then reflects a person's moral character. I studied the Odyssey, and I came down to believe that John Hick's The Odyssey made a lot of sense to me in terms of the veil of soul-making, that each of our choices would then reflect upon the morality of our souls or otherwise. But for me, from what you said today, there's no explanation as to the prompting cause as to what caused someone like Hitler or the architects of apartheid to actually do what they did. Yes, there's a social explanation in terms of them being products of the time and of their culture, but not everybody within that time and culture then went to the extent of actually doing massive harm to the rest of the population. So something causes that. And for some people, they hold back on their anger and their worst emotions, and other people let rip. And so I think the social explanation is part of the explanation. It's not the full explanation. And I believe there is a metaphysical a battle between good and evil, but we don't always understand its dimensions.
Yeah, but of course, what one has to do when trying to understand agents and practices. I mean, Hitler, for instance, reading Kershaw's huge 2-volume biography is a good start, because you do get a lot more about why Hitler was thinking the way he was thinking. And as for apartheid, I mean, it's such a weird case. I mean, the guy who constructed the apartheid policies, I mean, General Smuts, was also the guy who created the concept of ecology. He wanted to preserve these ecological niches and so on. And then you see this, how this idea is really taken from conserving natural wildlife into a political practice, creating the apartheid state and so on. So, I mean, and so, and if you ask me, how come Smuts didn't see how vile that very idea was? I mean, I really don't have an excellent answer for that. As for the metaphysics, no, of course, you can't get away from metaphysics. I mean, even in my talk today, in which I've attempted to do away with most of the metaphysical aspects of evil, I still continue to do a hell of a lot of metaphysics. But at least I try to make it somewhat less grandiose metaphysics, a little bit more tangible metaphysics, or everyday metaphysics, if you like. And as for Hicks, I think his book is interesting, and I also think that this phrase is taken from John Keats, thus, that the world is the veil of soul-making. Beautiful phrase, but I end up pretty unconvinced by Hicks' theodicy, because at the end of the day, it also ends up as after all, it's all for the good, which in some sense means denying that evil is really evil, because at the end of the day, it serves a good cause. So.
I don't know whether maybe we're in a situation now where we're facing these great, situations which a lot of the world will find evil in terms of natural, disasters happening around the world, potentially created by things that people are doing, which don't seem evil to them at all, as in trying to create a better life for themselves or whatever. So using more fossil fuels. I mean, I don't want to get into a big environmental argument, but what about that whole business where people doing things create an evil, or potentially creates an evil, that it isn't at all by people intending to be evil? What about that?
Of course, we know that category also from before. Good old-fashioned division of labor, each agent doing his own little bit, not too concerned about the overall picture, simply seems to lead to the evaporation of moral responsibility, because nobody is seems to be really in charge, and nobody is responsible. And of course, I think that we're all morally obligated to turn this moral gaze towards ourselves. To what extent do my actions contribute? And we're obligated to do that. And there are quite a number of pitfalls here in which we lose sight of the morally relevant aspects of what we do. And so what we do about that? Well, at least we could try to remind people of the morally relevant aspects of these practices. But I mean, I don't have a grand solution here. If I had, I would be really, really happy with myself. But I'm not that happy with myself. So.
Just a very quick question. Do you think the world is actually becoming a more evil place? Or does it go in some kind of cycles? Or how do you feel things
Actually,
move over time?
I'm not trying to, now I'm trying to avoid sounding like Leibnizian, saying that we live in the best of all conceivable worlds, but pretty much when you go into the statistics, most things are going better. We kill each other to an increasingly lesser extent, which is nice. There was, in terms of the number of democracies on the planet, the trend was wonderful for a long time. Unfortunately, for the last 4 years now, the number of democracies have been in decline. Let's hope that's not a longer trend. But all in all, I would say that if you could choose a point in time to be born into this world from the beginning of history and up until this very moment, I would say this very moment is probably as good as it gets. And that's not to deny that there are huge problems confronting us. But what I think that we definitely need here is some belief in our capacity to improve things little by little, not necessarily through these grand schemes, but a little bit at the time, that we at least occasionally manage to learn from the mistakes we do, and that we step by step can create a better world. In brief, a humanistic optimism. I think we really need that, and that's also why I think that the common climate of pessimism today is a little bit disturbing. I think that's exactly what we do not need at the moment.
One more.
To me, there's a difference between naughty, bad, and evil. You several times repeated ontologically that because we are human, because we are open or subject to free will, we're divided unequally in numbers, but we're all divided with good and evil. I see no reason for you to say that whatsoever. I think we have choices, and I think we have pressures, and people choose evil sometimes, or have the option to, or even unwittingly, and sometimes wittingly. But to say that this is basic to our makeup as humans by definition, I haven't been proven it.
Yeah. I would say that evil is as fundamental in understanding who we are as is goodness. And of course, most of us have only committed evil on a very small scale. I mean, I don't use the same distinctions as you do. But there is very little which prevents us from, in certain times and places, of kicking it up a couple of notches. And this potential is there, and therefore I'd like to highlight the continuity between the lesser evils and the larger ones. As for, I mean, and I really don't think that there is a single person who has never committed an evil act. I don't think so. But for most of them, it's on a pretty small scale, so you wouldn't refer to it as evil, I guess. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's it. So, thank you.